The Bible. It's a collection of ancient texts, prophecies, poetry, history, and letters. It holds stories of kings, shepherds, wars, and miracles. But for many, the Bible remains an unopened mystery. Here at The Bible Explained, we're not just reading verses, we're exploring the cultural bedrock and the dramatic narrative woven through its 66 books. Hit that subscribe button and let the journey begin.
Hey everyone, and welcome. We all know this image, right? The little manger, the shepherds, the wise men, all those animals gathered around under that big star. It's the Christmas story. We've seen it 1,000 times. But today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this whole scene. Because what if I told you that the story you have in your head isn't one single neat account? What if it's something way more complex and honestly a lot more interesting? Let's dig in. So here's the big reveal right up front. The nativity scene you put out every year is basically a mashup. It's a combination of two totally separate stories from the Bible, plus a whole bunch of extra details that got layered on over centuries of tradition and art. It's not one clean story, it's this beautiful, complicated tapestry.
Okay, so to untangle all this, we have to go right back to the beginning, to the only two original sources we actually have for the birth of Jesus, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And as you're about to see, they tell two very, very different stories.
And wow, when you put them side by side like this, the differences are just stark. In Matthew's version, the whole story revolves around Joseph. The focus is on Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, and the special visitors are the Magi. But then you flip over to Luke, and suddenly Mary is the main character. The focus shifts to Jesus as a savior for everyone, and the visitors are local shepherds. They both agree on the big stuff, Jesus born in Bethlehem to Mary and Joseph, but almost every other detail is completely different. And you know what? This is why most biblical scholars today don't even try to squish these two stories together into one timeline. They see them for what they are, two separate documents, each written to make a powerful theological point. Matthew was writing for a Jewish audience, trying to show how Jesus fulfilled all the prophecies of a Messiah king. But Luke, he was writing for a much wider, non-Jewish audience, and he wanted to highlight Jesus as a savior for everybody, especially the poor and the outsiders. Okay, so that's the theology, but what about the history? Because beyond the different points they're trying to make, the stories also have some famous historical puzzles that have kept people arguing for centuries.
Let's start with the big one, the one you hear about all the time, that Roman census in Luke's story. Luke says Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem because of a census ordered by Emperor Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Here's the problem. The historian Josephus tells us about a famous census under Quirinius, but he dates it to 6 AD. That's a full decade after King Herod, the villain from Matthew's story, died in 4 BC. So did Luke just get his facts wrong?
Well, it's complicated. First off, you gotta know that Emperor Augustus was obsessed with censuses. He bragged about them. It's totally plausible he ordered several. Some historians even think Quirinius might have served in that region earlier in a different role. But here's the real clue, Luke's specific wording. He calls it the first census under Quirinius. That little word might just be a hint that there's a more complex history here that we just don't have the full records for anymore. All right, let's move on to another huge part of the story. Maybe the most iconic image of all. No room at the inn. It's this heartbreaking moment, right? The Holy Family, turned away, left out in the cold. But what if the inn wasn't an inn at all?
This, right here, is an incredible example of how a tiny mistranslation can literally shape history. The original Greek word that Luke uses is kataluma. Now, that word doesn't mean a commercial hotel or a roadside inn. Overwhelmingly, it refers to a guest room in a private family home. You know, like the spare room you'd give to relatives who are visiting from out of town.
And that one word changes everything. The story probably isn't about some heartless innkeeper. It's about Joseph and Mary arriving at a relative's house in Bethlehem, which is absolutely packed because of the census. The katalima, the guest room, was already taken. So they did what you do. They made space in the main living area. In a typical peasant home back then, that was one big room where you'd often bring the animals in at night to keep them warm and safe. The manger was just a feeding trough, a handy, safe spot to lay a newborn baby. So it's a story of a crowded, bustling, but welcoming family, not a story of rejection. So we've sorted out the setting. Now, who shows up to the party? Our nativity scenes always have two very different groups hanging out together, the local shepherds and those mysterious magi. Okay, let's just get this out of the way. They never met.
Not in the Bible, at least. The shepherds belong only to Luke's story. They represent the poor and the humble being the first to hear the good news. The Magi? They're only in Matthew's story, representing the non-Jewish world coming to worship the new king. The only place they ever get together is in our modern nativity scenes. Let's zoom in on the Magi for a second, because their story is just wrapped in layers and layers of tradition and mystery. So who were these wise men from the East, really?
What Matthew actually says is they were magi from the East. The Magi were basically a class of Persian priests. Think astronomers, astrologers, interpreters of dreams. The whole idea of them being three kings came way later, around the 3rd century. Christians started connecting their story to Old Testament prophecies about kings from other nations coming to honor the Messiah.
And what about the number? Were there 3 of them? Well, the Bible never says. There could have been 2, there could have been 10. In fact, some early Eastern Christian traditions said there were 12. We get the number 3 simply because Matthew mentions they brought 3 specific gifts. And get this, even their famous names, Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, are a much, much later invention. They don't show up in any text until the 8th century. It just goes to show how these stories grow and evolve over hundreds of years.
So you can see how all these traditions get added on top of the original stories. Which brings us to the other big questions about the other familiar things we associate with Christmas, like the date or even the animals.
The Bible is completely silent on when Jesus was born. In fact, Luke mentioning shepherds watching their flocks by night probably suggests it wasn't the middle of winter. So, why December 25th? Where did that date come from?
Well, it seems to be a mix of things. On the one hand, you have early Christian theologians, like Hippolytus, doing some symbolic math. They figured Jesus must have been conceived on March 25th, a date associated with the creation of the world, and then they just added 9 months. But on the other hand, it's also no coincidence that December 25th was right in the middle of a huge Roman Winter Solstice festival called Saturnalia. So it was a very practical and powerful time to place a major Christian holiday.
Okay, last piece of the puzzle, the ox and the donkey. Every nativity scene has them, right? But guess what? You won't find them in Matthew or Luke either. So where on earth did they come from? Well, the clue seems to be right here, in this verse from the Old Testament prophet Isaiah.
So early Christians read that verse from Isaiah and had a total lightbulb moment. They put the ox and the donkey next to the manger as a powerful symbol. The message was that even these simple, humble animals recognized their creator while his own people didn't. It's not history, it's pure theology, brought to life in art.
So when you look at that simple nativity scene, you're not looking at one simple story. You're looking at a rich, complex tapestry. It's woven from 2 different theological stories from Matthew and Luke, stitched with threads of historical debate and colored by centuries of beautiful tradition, art, and symbolism. Every single piece is there for a reason. Which leaves us with one last question to think about. Does knowing that the story is this complex mashup, does that take away from it? Or does understanding where each piece comes from, the shepherds symbolizing humility, the magi symbolizing a universal king, the animals symbolizing creation itself, does that actually make the story richer and even more meaningful? That's the real question, isn't it? Thanks for joining me.
The Bible isn't just a history book. It's a living, challenging text. As you reflect on what we covered today regarding this topic, consider how this new context changes your reading of the verses. If you appreciated this breakdown, sharing it with just one friend who struggles with understanding the Bible is the best way you can support the channel. Subscribe for more, click here for your next explanation, and never stop seeking clarity. Until next time.